Hello, and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished law professor and author of The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR or on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast features CSRR's new report, Shining a Light on New Jersey's Secret State Intelligence System, which examines New Jersey law enforcement's unique use of CIA-style intelligence gathering, some of its known harms in certain well-documented instances like the city of Camden, and the Kafkaesque legal regime that works to keep vast amounts of public information out of the public eye. Our guests, Mike German, a former FBI agent, and Dylan Reisman, an attorney with the ACLU of New Jersey, will place the report's findings into the broader post-9/11 context of how fusion centers across the country threaten civil liberties and civil rights. Let's hear what our guests have to say about this timely topic affecting all Americans.
Michael joins us from the Liberty and National Security Program of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, where his work focuses on counterterrorism, law enforcement, and intelligence reform. He previously served 16 years as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1988 to 2004, where he conducted criminal investigations and undercover operations. He also served as an adjunct professor at the National Defense University and at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where he taught courses on terrorism, law enforcement, and civil liberties. He's also the author of Thinking Like a Terrorist: Insight of a Former FBI Undercover Agent, and Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, and How the New FBI Damages Democracy. Next, we welcome Dylan Reisman, who's a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey. He specializes in advocacy and litigation at the intersection of civil rights and technology. His main areas of focus include the government's use of artificial intelligence and surveillance technology. And prior to law school, Dylan was a software engineer and a tech policy researcher. Finally, we have Professor Sahar Aziz, who will round out today's presentations. Professor Aziz is a professor of law, Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar, and Middle East and Legal Studies Scholar at the Rutgers University School of Law. She's the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and her scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine the intersections of national security, race, and civil rights with a focus on the impact of national security on racial and ethnic and religious minorities. She's published over 30 academic articles and book chapters featured in law reviews across the nation, and her newest groundbreaking work is a book called The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which examines how religious bigotry racializes immigrant Muslims through a historical and comparative approach. I encourage our audience to consider purchasing it after today's event. I'll also now be ceding the floor to you, Michael, to kick off our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sahar, and the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for doing the research on the New Jersey Fusion Center, the Regional Intelligence and Operations Center, but also for just being a great partner in looking at how national security impacts communities here in the United States. So I started investigating fusion centers when I left the FBI. I left the FBI in 2004 and went to work at the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office in 2006 and noticed a bill that was sending $300,000 to state and local law enforcement intelligence centers, so-called fusion centers. And I'd only been out of law enforcement for 2 years, but I'd never heard of a fusion center and didn't know what this network that was being built was supposed to do and what it was for and who was going to run it. So at the ACLU, we started investigating these entities, which were really in their birth stage at that point. I think there were about 50 of them at that point. Now there's as many as 80 around the country. But what we found was that it was a mix of systems, that the federal government provided funding, provided personnel, FBI and DHS analysts, provided access to federal intelligence and counterterrorism systems, and even military systems and military personnel. But it was the state and local and regional authorities who were supposed to be operating these centers. And it struck me, we know from history that law enforcement intelligence is fraught with risk, that there's often the case that these operations, untethered from actual criminal law enforcement, become mechanisms of political suppression. So knowing that history, the last thing you'd want is an intelligence center that's unaccountable. And certainly that's what we found, that although the federal government had this role in creating them and establishing them in a network so they could all talk to one another and talk to the federal government, they didn't impose any direct regulation of them. And we basically highlighted 4 problems in our report. One was the ambiguous lines of authority, that if you have the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and state police and local police and others sitting together in a room and one of them violates your rights, how do you ever know? And the problem is, because intelligence is normally conducted in secrecy, that excessive secrecy, which is problem number 2, highlights the problem. And looking at the report issued by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, even attempting to use state open government laws to get access to information is very difficult. Prying information out of these agencies. Likewise, getting information using federal FOIA is different because everybody just passes the buck. Oh, this isn't a federal program, it's a state and local program. Oh, it's a state and local program, but those are federal resources and federal documents. They're owned by the federal government. And they can play this hide the ball with information. The third problem is the amount of data that these institutions have. They have access not just to federal, state, and local law enforcement data, but all sorts of subscriber services to gather data about Americans and community members. And in an unregulated environment, it's hard to know how that information is collected, how it's protected, how it's used, whether it's harmful to anyone. And the last 2 are private sector participation. They also incorporate private sector entities, really not further defined, into the Fusion Center. And these can include non-law enforcement government agencies, but also just private companies. And putting private interests into a law enforcement intelligence operation is highly problematic. And the last problem we identified was military involvement in fusion centers. Often this takes the form of the National Guard, which can be controlled by the state, but also can be incorporated into federal service. So again, without a strict oversight and strict regulations, it's really hard to know what those entities are doing in these centers. So the Brennan Center put out a report last year, Fixing Fusion Centers, I think it's called. I forgot the title. But basically, we looked at it from the federal angle, that if the federal government is going to resource these centers, it's up to the federal government to have strict regulations and oversight. But the other part is also true. If these centers are set up as state entities with state police and other state government entities involved, it's up to the states to regulate them too. But right now, what we have is an absence of regulation, and the amount of information is going out. And I'll just point out that, even if you aren't concerned at all about the privacy and civil liberties of your neighbors and are only concerned about security and think something like a fusion center might be a good idea, I would urge you to Google BlueLeaks, because that was a massive leak of fusion center related information based on a flaw in a security contractor's services that they were providing to fusion centers. And it released gigabytes worth of information that revealed not just fusion center operations, but FBI operations, DHS operations. So these centers have become a one-stop shop for any hostile foreign agency that might want to come in and collect it. So this kind of research is essential. So again, I commend the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that they engaged in this effort to uncover what's going on in the State Fusion Center and making sound recommendations to get these centers under control. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was profound insight. Definitely we'll look into those breaches later Dylan, floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me here today. And Michael, that was, I want to yes and everything you said, because everything you said is just so insightful and I have so much I want to react to. But first, I also want to say thank you to the center and thank you to Professor Aziz for having us here, because there's so much that we're starting to learn about in New Jersey that there just isn't enough momentum for, but we have to build that momentum and build that awareness, because as the report highlights, there's just this fundamental lack of transparency when it comes to our state surveillance infrastructure. So my first exposure to our Fusion Center, the Regional Operations Intelligence Center, I didn't understand it as a fusion center. I didn't understand its national security origins, but it actually sort of came up in that basic crime fighting context. It was actually a recent case that involved a robbery in West New York, and the police in West New York, all they had as a lead was surveillance footage. I mean, really no lead at all. They had surveillance footage of the robbery, though 2 eyewitnesses couldn't even give a description of the defendant, of the suspect. And they took the surveillance footage and they took a screenshot of the surveillance footage and they mailed it off to the Regional Operations Intelligence Center for facial recognition. So actually, there's a whole backstory to this case. The Regional Operations Intelligence Center failed to find anyone, but that was the first stop for this local small police department saying, who has the surveillance toys in our state? It's the Regional Operations Intelligence Center. So I think the thing that really this report and the sort of message I want to impart to everyone listening today is that New Jersey's surveillance infrastructure is growing out of control and with almost zero oversight. One thing I didn't know until the report was that the Regional Operation Intelligence Center's motto is all threats, all crimes, all hazards. This is a very far cry from what it was ostensibly for 20 years ago. And it really reflects, as the report highlights, that sort of mission creep, that when we make sensors, cameras, data available, the law enforcement government is going to try to use every single means at its disposal to carry out its various and competing missions. And those missions are not always friendly to the rights of the people being surveilled. I hope that goes without saying, but we could obviously talk more about that. So that original sort of reason and rationale, as the report highlights, was this sort of macro fear, this macro threat of terrorism. Though the sort of in the past decade and what we've seen that the report identifies is that the micro scale problems we face as a society, the one-offs, the fear of property crime, fear of auto theft, fear of petty theft, those, every single thing and every single problem our society faces becomes an excuse to build out surveillance infrastructure and fund more and more. The effect of this is social control. Surveillance is always unduly aimed at the sort of undesirable parts of society as determined by our sort of social narratives. In New Jersey, our communities of color, immigrant communities, and Muslim communities face this threat greater because they are the ones who the government has historically and always aimed its surveillance tools and policed. So every single time there's a camera on a street corner, we think it's easy, I think, as individuals to say, well, there are all these contexts in which surveillance seems like the reasonable thing to do. Why not aim a camera at a street corner? Don't we want to know when a car is stolen? But the effect and the cost of this we don't consider is the effect on disproportionately communities of color and immigrant communities, and also the insidious psychological and social effects on our rights of having a society in which we are constantly being watched. The chilling effect on protest, the chilling effect on free expression, all of these things. We can talk more about this. But I didn't want to just talk in abstraction because that's a little vague. I think the thing that the report really, the big yes and I have from the report is really yes, we're seeing so much of this infrastructure being built. And there are some stories that I think not many New Jerseyans are familiar with from the past, even just a couple months alone. And really at the center of the report and the center of our discussion today, we're talking about fusion centers. And New Jersey's Fusion Center, which is a centralized resource, a nonstop shop for all the surveillance needs that the local police can use to solve any crime they have. Not really, but we can just say it as that. But really, when it comes to the actual sensors and the actual funding, Michael talked about this. So much of it happens at this diffuse, decentralized local level. In New Jersey, we have, I believe, 564 municipalities and and this is actually an important note that we can talk about later because it's relevant, over 680 school districts. So that's a lot of local government decision makers. And they all, from various means of funding, various ordinances, have all these sorts of schemes and ways of building out the surveillance infrastructure that then gets centralized in places like fusion centers. So one story, for example, that was reported on very recently, in Elizabeth, the Elizabeth police are early adopters of this technology called Fusus, F-U-S-U-S is the company. So Fusion Center, Fusus, makes sense. And in Elizabeth, the goal of Fusus is that a lot of private businesses for years have had security cameras, private surveillance cameras. And when a crime happens and, something happens, sometimes the police will say, hey, business, would you give us your camera footage, for the investigation? And they consent. And that's an important step. They have to consent to that. What they try to solve is that given all of these private security cameras, how can we make it so that live video camera feeds from these surveillance cameras can be shunted to the police department so that they can now do live surveillance on these private cameras, which exist on this massive scale that's very difficult to deploy in public infrastructure. So that fundamentally sort of changes the relationship. It's actually also a very hard technical problem. I used to be a computer scientist. It's hard to get cameras to talk to each other. So it's this massive undertaking that's basically being subsidized by private business. And what ends up happening is that all of these camera footage gets sent to the police department. And Elizabeth has a policy called a virtual patrol policy that is paired up with predictive policing to basically, instead of having someone out on foot, out on patrol, say, officer, you sit behind the desk, and now you have access to all of the private surveillance cameras that we have access to in downtown Elizabeth, and we will monitor them. We will have predictive policing telling the officer which cameras to turn on at which time, and they can do a virtual patrol. This sort of just creates this aura of ever-present surveillance. And without complaints coming in, without anything, you just have officers just constantly watching, which at one point, everyone talks about science fiction and things, and sometimes I find that a bit obnoxious, but it is really the reality that we're living in, where you can fund these massive infrastructures of social control off of private funding, basically. So that's one example, and the sort of thing that goes without notice, I think, a lot, and we need more oversight for it. And it's really not a leap to say that the future of these types of cameras and systems is centralized state oversight. Another technology we've been tracking a lot of is automated license plate readers. Much like how every single social problem becomes an excuse to build surveillance infrastructure, automated license plate readers are meant to, as cited by the governor and the governor's office, are meant to combat rising auto theft. And so much money has been poured into giving grants to local governments to fund automated license plate readers and install them around their town. And these readers, sit on street corners, sit at key intersections, sit within police cars and read the license plates of cars and then automatically read them and create a database of where a car was at a particular time. This technology has existed for over a decade. The real development in the past couple of years has been that the sharing infrastructure of this technology has really become national. And so that when police departments install this technology, they're expected to share their data with other police departments, with the state. The state police has their own account and gets data from police departments across the state. This data gets shared with the federal government. And it also gets shared with police departments in other states, which actually recently our colleagues in the ACLU's California affiliates challenged this policy because one of the threats this poses is that for, say, abortion access, if you have an automated license plate reader near a clinic of some kind, all of a sudden now other states that want to prosecute their own citizens or other citizens who seek an abortion, or I should say residents seeking an abortion outside of their state, they can go to New Jersey. And if that data from a New Jersey police department or a California police department gets shared with a less abortion-friendly jurisdiction, now all of a sudden that data is just out there largely uncontrolled. this also is an example of the way that New Jersey kind of lags, I think, on transparency, lags on safety precautions for this kind of technology. In states where legislatures have taken an active role in oversight, they've often instituted rules where there's data retention requirements. You can only keep police department, you can only keep the data for months at a time, weeks at a time. Some have even days. A couple even have, I think at least one state even has minutes at a time. Like the data gets read. Does the license plate match a watch list, a be on the lookout list for cars we're trying to track? If it doesn't, we throw out the data. New Jersey's retention period, only set by Attorney General guideline, is 3 years. We maintain the movements of cars within our state for 3 years. And I think that's the sort of question and democratic oversight that is very difficult when we have such a lack of transparency, which the report calls out. One last example I'll give. Actually, I won't even give that example. We can talk about it more if we want. We don't know as much about the use of drones in our state, but there are a lot of examples from other jurisdictions of drones monitoring protests during 2020, in particular, George Floyd uprisings, Black Lives Matter protests. There are many stories of surveillance cameras, of drones, of the police monitoring the protests in the name of things like crowd control and safety, but leading to the prosecution of protesters for their First Amendment activity. These are things that just the mere presence of surveillance enables. And so in closing, there's so much we don't know, but so many hints of the sprawling nature of our surveillance infrastructure. And I'm particularly excited if this report kicks off an effort to sort of try and actually corral that and do that. I think it would be a beautiful thing. And because before we even get into the wisdom of these things, we can't even talk about it because all of the evidence, all of the proof of its efficacy is just bald assertions that these things are necessary and work without considering the very real cost to people's rights and to people's lives. So with that, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking more.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was incredibly insightful. Just makes my skin crawl, honestly, just knowing that we're scratching the surface with what we do know. And really, I urge everyone to read the CSRR report on this. I'd like to remind our audience members to please go ahead and write your questions down in the Zoom Q&A function. I do see an audience member is raising their hand, and we have that feature to consolidate everyone's questions, and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentations. And finally, I'd like to heed the floor to Professor Aziz.
Thank you so much, Aya, and thank you, Mike and Dylan. I never cease to learn something new, right? Every time I hear my fellow civil liberties and civil rights advocates. And I will just put a special pitch for Mike German's work, because his work and his advocacy work, his books, his policy papers really informed me, right? When I was a younger, more junior lawyer. So thank you, Mike. In case you need validation, you are making an impact. So keep writing and keep advocating. Before I kind of start my formal comments, I will just put on the screen. This is our fabulous report, shining a light on New Jersey's secret intelligence system. It's available on our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. So I hope everyone will find the time to read it if they have not already. So I'll just use my time to give the highlights and some key points from that report, which we're very thankful at the Center for the co-authors, Colin Kombacher, Iman Bokadoum, and Warda Hassan, who was a 3L, who was also a co-author along with myself. So thank you to the team for working together to produce this report. So many of us who have been studying civil liberties or working on civil liberties know that they have been eroding for over 2 decades, especially after 9/11. In the name of national security, federal agencies working with their state counterparts have built an expansive homeland security apparatus, facilitated by laws granting national security officials broader surveillance and investigative authorities. And prior to the attempted insurrection of January 6, 2021, these national security powers nearly exclusively targeted Muslim and Arab communities. And these same powers, especially at the state level, also serve to further the mass incarceration of African American communities. The most invasive and simultaneously secret post 9/11 tool has been these state fusion centers. They coordinate federal, state, and local law enforcement through complex intelligence gathering systems that retain, analyze, synthesize, and distribute data with minimal oversight. And that's really the emphasis of our report, that there is no oversight in New Jersey. And so as a result, these fusion centers have become institutionalized within the American law enforcement framework, notwithstanding that there doesn't seem to be, or we cannot find any tangible results to show that they are in fact performing their intended original purpose, which was to prevent terrorism in supposedly a non-racialized way. So New Jersey's Fusion Center is no exception. It's commonly referred to as the Regional Operations and Intelligence Center, or ROIC. It actively supports local and state law enforcement, and it's driven by what is often referred to as intelligence-led policing, or ILP. It assists police departments, and as Dylan mentioned, there are hundreds of those in New Jersey, in what is known as quality of life policing, or also known as zero tolerance policing, or also known as broken windows policing. And one city that's singled out for such treatment is Camden, New Jersey, where the concept of privacy is now a quaint anachronism. The unprecedented surveillance apparatus has been used to enforce a locally sourced variant of this intelligence-led policing model, also called more benignly community-led policing. In this predominantly black and brown city, law enforcement inflates its numbers by charging myriad low-level offenses. And such aggressive policing and charging decisions have led to a strain on the municipal court system. Meanwhile, how this vast, widespread surveillance unmoored to terrorism, has nothing to do with terrorism, actually works in practice is entirely opaque. So to attempt to understand that relationship between traditional state and county law enforcement and the Fusion Center, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights conducted a year-long investigation using the New Jersey Open Records Act, OPRA. But these efforts, unfortunately, proved all but fruitless as countless agencies stonewalled and stymied questions of vast public importance. And their responses and lack thereof also proved informative, showing the extent to which law enforcement will go to maintain that wall of secrecy as it relates to the Fusion Center. So accordingly, our report makes 3 recommendations. First, Governor Murphy should appoint an ombudsman to oversee the New Jersey intelligence system, and especially the ROIC. Although Executive Order 5 authorizes the New Jersey Office of the Public Advocate to appoint an ombudsman to ensure privacy and civil liberties are protected, no such appointment has yet to occur in 2023. The second recommendation is that the New Jersey legislature should mandate by law more regular reporting by the Chief Intelligence Director to the legislature. Again, we have not seen any evidence of that. And finally, the third recommendation is that civil society, preferably within New Jersey, should conduct a people's audit of the Fusion Center to determine the privacy impact on New Jersey's diverse populations. We believe that these recommendations together can help mitigate abuse from intelligence collection authorities that are often directed at minority and low-income communities. So let me step back just a little to give you some context in New Jersey. On March 16, 2006, then New Jersey Governor Corzine, via Executive Order 5, established what is called the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, NJOHSP, in New Jersey, as the state's primary intelligence agency. Its mission is to, quote, enhance New Jersey's capability to prevent, protect against, respond to, and recover from, and mitigate acts of terrorism and other catastrophic incidents, end quote. The NJOHSP, or the Homeland Security Agency for New Jersey, is the central point of contact with federal and other state agencies within and outside of New Jersey on national security matters. It also coordinates the state police and local precincts on intelligence gathering and dissemination. And it also houses New Jersey's sole fusion center. So again, we only have one, whereas other states like California and Texas have as high as 8 or 10 fusion centers. Now, this arrangement arguably vests the New Jersey Homeland Security Agency with latitude to operate outside the bounds of oversight that anchor most other state agencies, because it is within but not part of the state's Department of Law and Public Safety. So there's this jurisdictional gap, right, that allows the agency, the New Jersey Agency for Homeland Security, to operate outside the typical checks and balances. And so as a result, there was a study of the ROIC, which we quote or cite in our report, estimates that half of the civilian analysts at the Fusion Center were in fact employees of the Office of Homeland Preparedness. Yet they have very limited oversight to the governor's office because the Homeland Security Agency is a cabinet level agency created by executive order. All right. So another component of it is something called the New Jersey Shield, which is the most recent intelligence gathering program consisting of a partnership between the Fusion Center and the Homeland Security State Agency. It was launched on April 14th, 2021, which was just a couple years ago. And the New Jersey Shield is supposed to, quote, focus on strengthening information sharing and collaboration among the public and private sectors, end quote. It expands the Fusion Center's information sharing activities across not only law enforcement entities, but also the public and the private sector. So you see this intelligence web expanding. We believe this is a step in the wrong direction. New Jersey should make moves towards curtailing, not enhancing, the Fusion Center's power in the immediate future, particularly given its promotion of racialized broken windows policing. And the Fusion Center also applies intelligence-led policing to crime fighting, which replaces evidence-driven investigations with mass data collection and speculative reporting of possible threats. So this problematic way of crime fighting supplants traditional due process expectations that all persons are innocent until proven guilty. So specifically, intelligence-led policing tends to shortcut probable cause requirements for getting a warrant prior to surveilling persons within the U.S. and instead allows local and state police to gather volumes of data on any person within the U.S., and then that data can be mined. And so the ACLU has summed up this practice, which is, again, a nationwide problem, with the following kind of conclusion, quote, this new theory of criminal intelligence argues that collecting even outwardly innocuous behaviors will somehow enhance security. The erosion of reasonable limits on police intelligence powers has set the stage for a return of the abusive practices of the past. In recent years, the ACLU has uncovered substantial evidence that domestic intelligence powers are being misused at all levels of government to target nonviolent political activists, end quote. And we've also seen it target Muslim and Arab South Asian communities in the last 20 years. So one scholar that we relied heavily on his excellent research was Maine University criminology professor Brendan McQuaid, who had visited the ROIC, the Fusion Center, and conducted dozens of interviews with law enforcement throughout New Jersey. So he had original research that essentially confirmed what we had suspected. Professor McQuaid concluded that rather than sobering analysis of realistic dangers, the ROIC's reports construct the threat of terrorism, end quote. This is because the ROIC, end quote, this is start quote, this is his language, are not grounded in a set blueprint. Instead, they construct these terrorist threats while also supporting broken windows policing. So again, consistent with our findings, Professor McQuaid recommends that public awareness of the Fusion Centers is essential given the lack of government oversight, whether it's executive oversight or legislative oversight, since its inception in 2006. Now, let me just go a little bit into broken windows policing in case people are not as familiar. Broken windows policing has been rebuked by legal scholars as a tool of mass incarceration of racial minorities for so-called quality of life crimes. Aggressive enforcement of misdemeanor offenses like riding a bike without a bell or petty drug possession entails an intelligence component where law enforcement contacts with the community, ostensibly to field concerns in a collaborative fashion called community-led policing, but double as gaining sources of information. And the data provided to the public by the Fusion Center provides no evidence that arrests initiated by the Fusion Centers are actually terrorism related. So again, taking it far afield from its original intent. And local law enforcement systems and surveil persons living in New Jersey, and we give Camden as the most egregious example, do not support ROIC's or the Fusion Center's original mission, which is to interdict terrorism plots. Instead, their mission creep is how Fusion Centers across the countries have, in the absence of terrorism, justified their budgets. Let me give you an example. So Operation Summer Shield, which was initiated in 2010 by the New Jersey Attorney General's office, morphed into Operation Summer Shield 2, and then later into Operation Safer Streets. And each of these programs relied heavily on the Fusion Center data collection to make arrests for quality of life criminality, like vagrancy, vandalism, riding a bike without a bell, I kid you not, that was literally an offense, and process crimes such as parole violations and nonviolent drug offenses. And so according to Professor McQuaid, from July through October 2014, for example, the Camden County Police wrote 99 tickets, this is in the span of 4 months, for riding a bicycle without a bell. In the previous year, they had issued only one of those such tickets. So the lack of articulable suspicion is glaring. So in another example, in a February 2008 report titled, this is a suspicious activity report, titled Altered Bus in Fairfield, New Jersey Presents Concerns, the Fusion Center analyst described in detail how a bus was pulled over where the driver allegedly had modified the bus to evade fuel taxes. The possible terror connection, the Fusion Center analyst claimed, was that such alterations demonstrate the potential for a bus to be turned into a large vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, end quote. Whereas I think what was really happening is the bus driver owner just didn't want to pay taxes. But this is an example of this mission creep. So our report's conclusion highlights that no actual threat existed, and instead, the Fusion Center decided that the physical components allegedly used to facilitate a banal tax evasion scheme might in some way be used by terrorists to conduct some kind of terrorism at some point in the future. Such speculative, far-fetched theories further demonstrate the need for robust legislative oversight. One more example before I conclude. For cities like Camden, whose population is 39% African American, broken windows policing has eviscerated privacy. Well over 150 documented surveillance devices are watching, listening, and scanning citizens at all hours of the day. So as one supervisor explained, we're actually going to ride along with you. And when you lock up somebody in Camden, we're going to debrief them and interview them. So this is an agent in the Fusion Center Intelligence Collection Cell. Law enforcement, with the Fusion Center's guidance, has made that decision for everyone within the city limits of Camden. As one expert in the Fusion Center puts it, the mere concept of privacy under a city regulated by the Fusion Center's eyes and ears becomes, quote, a pedantic concern and abstract formalism, end quote. And so as our report shows, there's plenty of facts that we cite that these fusion centers are effectively these localized spy centers that seem to have nothing to do with terrorism, but everything to do with racial profiling and contributing to the mass incarceration of African American and Latino communities. So our recommendations are, I'll just go back to that, to bring transparency and accountability to the New Jersey Fusion Center, we make 3 recommendations. First, an ombudsman must be appointed to oversee New Jersey's intelligence regime. The New Jersey Office of the Public Advocate has the authority to appoint such an ombudsman to ensure privacy and civil liberties protections are upheld. But this has yet to be done. So we call on Governor Murphy to ensure that an ombudsman is in fact appointed. Second, legislative action is necessary to legally mandate regular reporting by the state's chief intelligence officer, who effectively oversees all of the various intelligence collection agencies, including the Fusion Center. And we point this out in our report, we're particularly troubled by the fact that the current chief intelligence officer is a former CIA officer. And as we've seen with the NYPD and with other examples, when the CIA gets involved in domestic intelligence gathering, civil liberties tend to be marginalized, if not outright violated. So I think that's also cause for concern in terms of the types of training the CIA officers have. So this ensures that New Jersey's domestic intelligence gathering apparatus is focusing on actual terrorist threat while preserving civil liberties for all. And then finally, civil society should conduct a people's audit that explores the inner workings of the Fusion Center to determine the privacy and other costs it exacts on New Jersey's diverse populations. But of course, this is going to require a coalition, which we hope that this event and our report and other advocacy activities will trigger, because in fact, there are 2 instructive case studies that offer a template for people's audit: California and Maine, where local groups obtained raw data via public records requests. Civil society in those states used transparency tools to hold accountable their fusion centers. And in Maine, a coalition worked together to issue a groundbreaking publication documenting a campaign that culminated in the passage of historic legislation mandating reporting by the Maine Fusion Center. The burden is on us as citizens of this country, or residents of this country, and as civilians to have to force the hand of our elected officials and our government that is operated based on our taxes to protect our civil liberties. So in conclusion, much more needs to be done to ensure that New Jersey's residents are protected from discriminatory, unwarranted, sprawling surveillance. And the residents of New Jersey deserve to know whether their taxes are spent on unlawful surveillance. They also deserve to live free of invidious discrimination by law enforcement. Implementing robust and independent oversight over New Jersey's intelligence system is an essential first step toward those important goals. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.